Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we're going to be reading true hurricane survivor horror stories. I hope you enjoy them. So, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories. In November of 2012, Hurricane Sandy hit our forested property near the Delaware River in New York. We had thought that since we lived a couple of hours inland and over 1,000 feet higher than sea level, we were fairly safe. We've always made some preparations in case of emergencies, but we had a lot to learn about being ready for a situation like this. We knew the storm was approaching quickly, and it was going to be severe. We had waterproof canoeing go bags ready, and we had a 625-gallon above-ground water storage tank and a good, non-electric water purification system. Even our dog had his saddlebags packed with his food and supplies. But we were not prepared for the intensity of this storm. Bugging out was not an option, at least by car. When the storm hit, the winds kept getting stronger. Just when we thought it was as bad as it could get, the wind picked up even more. Trees blew down and ripped out the power lines to our house. The circuit breaker box exploded. Several large conifers fell on top of our house, partially crushing the roof. Our daughter was watching the storm just as the wind hit, and a huge tree blew down and landed directly on the roof above her room. An old garden trellis made from large timbers took the brunt of the force and probably saved her life. We gathered the kids to the center of the little house, as far from the windows as we could get. We had a few battery-powered LED lanterns lit because the power was out. Trees and downed power lines blocked our street, so we had to shelter in place and tough it out. I think there might have been a tornado along with the hurricane, because some trees were twisted in half and not just blown down in one direction. Once the storm passed, we had to assess the damage. No one was hurt, thankfully. We made sure the propane tank was shut off and every appliance was unplugged. Clearing the driveway and property of downed trees and debris took several days. We had no intention of clearing out the road of trees. It was too dangerous since the power lines crisscrossed everywhere. We were able to check on our neighbors and offer what assistance we could. We had to stay in the house since the roads were impassable and dangerous. Since we have a private well and use an electric well pump, we had no running water. We had plenty of fresh water in the water tank, fortunately, and every drop of water we consumed went first through our countertop purification system. After the house was rebuilt and the storm was mostly behind us, we made lists of things that we could have done better. The first thing we did was to make a plan in case we got separated. Perhaps next time an emergency struck, we might not all be home. We planned where we could meet and who we might call for information. Over the next couple of years, we invested a wood-burning stove and a generator that could run on either gasoline or propane. Gasoline was scarce for weeks after the storm and rationed. 20-pound propane tanks were available, though. We also built a battery bank for backup power. Several deep-cycle batteries connected to a power inverter. So we had 2 power sources. We now all keep a pair of jeans and sturdy slip-on shoes next to our bed, so we're ready to go in 5 minutes flat. A few other changes we made to our preparations. We got 2 camp-style toilets, emergency non-perishable foods like freeze-dried backpacking meals, MREs, canned foods, more lanterns and extra batteries of all types. A good quality AM/FM and weather radio that runs on either batteries, AC power, or a crank/dynamo. And we doubled the size of our garden. Some 8 years later, we continue to improve our emergency preparations and refine our plans. I have been through 3 major hurricanes that tore up my area of Virginia pretty badly. My first lesson learned was Hurricane Isabel in 2003. Isabel really messed our area up in the northern neck of Virginia. No power for 13 days. Nowhere to get gas or ice. I will never forget the howling of the winds, or thinking, will this ever stop? Many houses were lost in the Rappahannock and Potomac rivers during Isabel. My next experience was Hurricane Irene. A microburst, powerful wind, came right across the street. It looked like someone's hand just cut a swath right through the trees. The sound of that wind. It creeps me out every time. No power again for 7 days. Last year, Hurricane Michael got us. No power for 5 days, and many main roads washed out. Several roads were impassable until this past March. I do not play with these storms. Do not think that just because you're not taking a direct hit that it can't be destructive. Prepare ahead of time. Buy lots of water. Fill up large buckets with water to flush toilets. Buy batteries, charcoal to cook food, table sandwiches, food like peanut butter and jelly will help too. Always have paper plates and plastic utensils. Get baby wipes for personal hygiene for everyone, not just babies. Fill your vehicles up with gas and remember your pets. Get extra pet food, litter, etc. Get your prescription and over-the-counter medicines ahead of time. And don't forget, you need a NOAA weather radio when the power goes out to stay on top of things. Be prepared to be self-sustaining for days, because you will be without power for days and possibly stranded for days. Do not ever wait until the last minute to gather supplies. And if they tell you to evacuate, then please do it. I'm a retired man who lives in Tampa Bay area and lost power for 73 hours as a result of Hurricane Irma. I slept like a baby for 3 nights and did not lose any food to spoilage. I took some common sense steps to achieve those results. I froze tap water in several 2-liter bottles. I also froze bottles of bottled water, 16 to 20 ounce size preferred. I assumed I would lose power, so I turned the AC down from the usual 76 to 71, so when my power went off the walls, ceilings and floors would be at 71 instead of 76, keeping me cooler for longer. I never opened up any windows. Better to have 80-degree air in my condo without humidity than 85 to 90-degree outside air with humidity. The combo temp reached a high of 80 after 3 days. When I went to bed the second and third night, I took 2 frozen bottles of water and put each in a Ziploc bag to collect condensation, and put each water in a sock. Then I replaced a bottle on side of me to help me keep my body temperature down. When I woke up, the ice was water, and I now had more water to drink. The last day I did the same as number 4 above, but placed bottles on each side of me while sitting in my chair. I was cool as a cucumber. No reason old people should be dying of heat stroke. I also poured cold water onto a towel and wrapped it around my neck. Wring out and repeat. When power went out, I took all of my frozen food and bottles of water and packed it into coolers, and put the coolers into the freezer and refrigerator. My food was still frozen when the power was restored 73 hours later. I took shelves out of the refrigerator section and put all of my refrigerated food, beverages, and condiments into coolers, along with the 2 frozen liter bottles of water. Food was in perfect condition 73 hours after losing power. Pack remaining space around the outside of coolers with as many frozen bottles of water as you can fit. I believe that these tips will keep food cold for 5 to 7 days and provide plenty of cooling water. As a member of Bellevue Hospital Medical Center medical staff, I helped evacuate the hospital during Hurricane Sandy. I'm a registered nurse, and with the help of all the staff and many city and governmental agency staff members, we evacuated 520 patients to area hospitals. When I say all the staff, that meant people from accounting, chaplains, medical residents, and even 2 brand new nurses. I was assigned to the 14th floor. I was instructed that because of my seniority, to guide the 2 new nurses during the hurricane. Talk about trial by fire. We lost power the second day while the storm was raging. We ended up having to carry patients down from as high as the 22nd floor. When I say all governmental agencies, we had Oklahoma City Fire, Homeland Security, and the U.S. Army helping. I have to say everyone pitched in. There was an unbelievable sense of camaraderie. When New York City needed help in its most desperate hour, the Bellevue staff, and especially the nursing staff, answered the call for help and came to the hospital. We evacuated 520 patients with 1 birth and 1 cardiac bypass along the way, and everyone was safely evacuated. We are flood victims from Hurricane Irma. We live in Jacksonville, Florida. Hurricane Irma hit us on September 11th, 2017. Thank God we had some friends we were able to stay with who lived on higher ground. Thank God we got out of there and moved our van. I believe they said the hurricane was a Category 5. When we were allowed back in, we were told we had to move out within 7 to 10 days and that we needed to throw everything out. The river was very dirty, and it came up 2 feet. They brought great big dumpsters in, and all of us on ground floor filled them with our furniture. It was the most devastated situation I've ever been in. I thought I was going to have a nervous breakdown. It was horrible. I wasn't worried about our belongings, but we came very close to being homeless. I'm 69 years old, and I take care of my 82-year-old uncle. When we got older, we don't cope with things as well as when we were younger. Most of our family has passed away, and the ones who haven't are old and not able to help us. Most of our friends have passed away also, so we came very close to being homeless. We moved 2 times and are moving again. This has been a nightmare. There is so much to tell, but this kind of sums it up. Thank God we received some help from FEMA and from the country western singers who put on a concert to collect money. Truly, we appreciate all the prayers, love, and concern that people have shown us. By the way, they have a tentative date to move back on July 20th, 2018. We have a lot of work that has to be done as soon as we can get back in. No bodily harm and no lives were lost, and we now can see the light at the end of the tunnel.
I remember the day Hurricane Ike struck Texas and Louisiana back in 2008. It was Friday night, September 12, 2008, in Houston, Texas. I was 11 at the time, and my mom and dad were sitting in front of the TV, watching as Ike crept closer towards Texas. My dad went to Walmart and got some dry food, flashlights, and batteries for the storm. I was really nervous because of the size of Ike. It was 450 miles wide, and the damage it might cause overnight. I was walking around thinking the worst, and even taking a long last look at my apartment complex with my neighbor's friend. It started getting windy around 6 p.m., winds around 40 miles per hour, and we got scared and ran home. Twigs from the 100-foot pine trees started to break off, and leaves were flying everywhere. My mom and I were walking to Pop's supermarket to get some last-minute things, and the checkout line was long. When we were finally done, the winds blew open the door, and everybody went silent. We went home quickly. Dad was in the bedroom with his hard hat on playing with the flashlight as he watched the news. There was a phone bank with citizens asking questions to Dr. Neal on Channel 11 about what kind of damage they could expect. I ran outside at 10 p.m., and the winds were still at 40 miles per hour, but they started to gust past 50, and I was on my porch watching the palm tree near me sway in the wind. The tall pine trees were bending slightly as I heard them rustle in the wind. More leaves and trash were airborne now. I couldn't stand against wind as I tried to go downstairs, and the wind kept pushing me back. I gave up and went back upstairs once my folks told me it's no longer safe to be wandering. The wind was howling at the back window. My dad managed to use an old bed to cover the window, and it was reinforced with the couch in his bedroom. I tried to fall asleep, but the wind was howling constantly, and gusts started to become a little more frequent. At around 11:30 p.m., it was getting blustery outside, and my dad tried to microwave a burrito. Worst time for a snack. And the lights started to flicker. We ran to the closet, but we started to fuss when my mom didn't want to get in. She was terrified, and we tried to calm her down, but another loud gust blew in, and the carport downstairs started rumbling. The wind was starting to make squealing and screeching noises. We were silent for a couple minutes, staring at the back window. I could see an outline of the trees whipping in the wind from the streetlight. Dad and I went inside, and Mom slept in the living room. For another 30 minutes, the lights would flicker as we listened to Paul and Tom on the radio. I lay down on the floor, and Dad sat on his big toolbox, playing with the flashlight. Around 12:30 a.m., we lost power, and he winds got louder. It sounded like a train 1 minute and a wolf howling the next second. The winds were probably between 70 and 80 by that time. My dad went out to get my mom, but I remember my mom opening the door to look outside to get a peek. It was terrifying. In the sea of darkness, the palm tree was bending back and forth violently. Water was falling from the roofs like Niagara Falls. The giant pine trees were bending at 45-degree angles with branches snapping off. Mom closed the door and finally took refuge in the closet. She was crying at one point, and we told her we were going to make it out. At 1:30 a.m., the back window shattered, and glass and rain started to come in. I flashed a light to help Dad see, and he had to get some trash bags to cover the TV and computer in his room, and push the couch to push the beds that were covering the broken window back up. But the wind kept pushing them down. Around 2 a.m., the radio said Ike made landfall at Galveston and Houston, and the surrounding area was being battered by high winds and heavy surge flooding. Dad took note of the sky looking orange when we opened the closet door to let some cool air in, since it was hot inside the closet. I heard debris hitting the building, and the wind was deafening. The winds were above 75 miles per hour around that time. All night the wind was screaming. We spent 10 to 12 hours in the closet until noon Saturday. It was a mess outside. Shingles littered the floor, and tree branches and twigs were everywhere. My dad's old pair of shoes were still next to the door. The courtyard was even worse. Pine trees were snapped in half, and entire trees were down on the ground. I helped our neighbors clean up the debris and clear the pathways. Dad went to get more food and water. We ate what we could, and had to walk around to find some food and hot water. Mom and Dad were upset but glad we made it out unscathed. We walked around the neighborhood seeing the damage. A lot of tree damage and some leaning power lines. I couldn't sleep that Saturday night with all the humidity. My mom and I were listening to updates from the mayor and city officials. We were both scared out of wits, and I cried, but my mom reassured me that we made it, and we are okay. By Sunday afternoon, the power was restored, and we started to learn about the true devastation Ike did to the state. I was thankful that we didn't lose our home or lives for that manner. Some areas along the coast were wrecked or wiped out from the storm surge. I remember the reporter on 13 trying to get a grip on his emotions as he went through the damage and ruins at Bolivar Peninsula. Watching the wreckage, it ran a chill down my spine. But it showed me the true power of these cyclones. Ike would cause me to take preparations more seriously, and now I stock more supplies to prepare for every season. I know it's not much of a story, but tropical cyclones are nothing to mess with. The story I will tell my kids one day. I had never witnessed that level of destruction or devastation before. The eye of the storm hit around 10:30 p.m., so most of the guests, including myself, were sheltered in the hotel ballroom. What made this storm unique, and the reason it caught the southern Baja Peninsula so off guard, was the fact that it rapidly intensified and changed course. It was originally forecast to head west and weaken as it went out to sea, but instead, it made an almost 90-degree turn and headed directly for Cabo San Lucas as a Category 4. It was a Category 3 when it actually made landfall, but the millibars of pressure in the eye were extremely low for a Category 3, and the hurricane slowed and caused massive destruction. Because of the initial forecast, people were not being encouraged to evacuate. Our hotel was prepared as possible and technically designated as a hurricane shelter with the ability of a Cat 3 storm, and had excellent safety procedures in place. But no one expected the storm to be as bad as it was. The hotel had a shelter set up in the hotel ballroom, but also told guests that if they felt more comfortable staying in their rooms, then they were more than welcome to do so, so long as they kept the windows and doors completely shut and did not venture outside. At the point of their original instruction, the hurricane was still not expected to be such a massive threat. My friends and I originally thought we would ride it out in our hotel room, and were almost poking fun at the evacuation room that was set up. We figured we would hole up in our room with food and wine and watch movies until the government formally shut down the power grid, as planned and mentioned in the bulletins they were sending us. Everything was going as planned for us until about 8:30 p.m. The sliding glass doors were shaking violently, and then all of a sudden a large portion of a palm tree snapped off and hit our window. It didn't shatter, fortunately, but the scare was enough for us to put all of our things in the bathroom, grab our passports and wallets, and make a beeline for the hotel ballroom. At that point in our room, there was water already starting to gurgle, get sucked out of the toilet, and the shower was making a howling noise. It also took 3 of us to pull the hotel door open because of the low pressure suction. The hotel hallways were partially outside and exposed to the elements. By the time we, safely, thankfully, made it to the hotel ballroom, the hotel staff were already running rescue operations to retrieve people from their rooms. They were taking attendance on the hotel room roster and rescuing accordingly. There was an elderly couple being carried in with blood all over them from being cut by glass and some other injuries. None of them major, thanks to the incredible care and rescue effort of the hotel staff. The pictures on link below will tell the story of the destruction, but the main reason I felt that this was an important story to share is because Odile was a storm that took everyone by surprise. We were incredibly lucky to be in the care of the hotel workers who slaved away all night to keep us safe, but a lot of people were not so lucky, and the widespread destruction over the Baja Peninsula was immense. So, for anyone else who doubts the power of Mother Nature and doesn't take weather warnings seriously, just take some advice from anyone who experienced Odile. Weather forecasts can change in a heartbeat, so always err on the side of caution. We were stranded in Cabo for an extra week because the airport was completely destroyed. There was no phone service, internet, or any other form of communication. Our friends and family feared the worst after they didn't hear from us for several days. Food and water had to be rationed. The Mexican military had to perform food drops for the local residents because all of the roads were washed out. I could write a book about all of the experiences of that week, but I will let my photos do the talking. Needless to say, I made some lifelong friends during that week and saw things that I couldn't imagine even in my wildest dreams. Mother Nature is beautiful and amazing, but give her respect before it's too late and she demands it from you.
I live practically dead center of North Carolina. The only hurricane to pass over me in my lifetime was Fran on September 5th of 1996. I had 3 pet potbelly pigs at the time. We had a nice big pig palace, fenced in and well built. My husband built it, and he is meticulous in everything that he does. I got Nora first, and when I got Arthur and Robert a couple years later, she never forgave me for it. I used to let them roam around our yard, snuffling and digging, until time to be fed and go to bed. Nora was mad at me and refused to go in the pen, much less the house. It got windier, darker and wetter, and yet Nora refused. The more I prodded, chased, K-holed, tempted, and food and cussed, the more pig-headed Nora became. I kept this up for about an hour in the dark, getting drenched despite the umbrella, crying and worrying until I could no longer do it and feel the least bit safe, which was about 3.5% by that time. My husband was asleep already and slept the entire night, completely oblivious to the goings-on outside, and to his wife right beside him, tossing and turning and worrying. The next morning, when all was said and done, we look out and saw the damage. Lots and lots of trees down. The roof blown off the well house, and the giant oak tree at the corner of the house had been uprooted and taken the power lines down with it. It was parallel to the house about 3 feet away. There between the house and the tree was Nora, shaking and in shock. It took a couple of days to get Nora back to normal, about a week to get power and water restored, and weeks to get everything else taken care of. That was an experience I'll never forget, and surely not one that I'd ever want to go through again. I'm a Florida native, and most recently went through Matthew and Irma. Generally, the hurricane itself is not the worst part. The aftermath is. Hurricanes are a siege situation. So if you're going to stay put, you need at least a gallon of water per person per day. They say for at least 3 days. I always up this to 7 days. That's your drinking water. You'll want more water for non-drinking purposes. You can fill your bathtub ahead of time. Do this a couple of days before so that you can make sure your tub will hold water and not drain it out all overnight. Make sure you have the same 7-day supply of food that doesn't need to be cooked or refrigerated for yourself and your animals, and the same for medication. And gas in the tank. Do this early. You're almost certain to lose power during the storm. Think of this as inevitable. You may be out of power for days afterwards. I didn't get my power back until a week after Irma. It was miserable. If your power company isn't prepared for the massive amount of damage to the grid, you may be out of power for several weeks, like many were in 2004. Be mindful of what you won't have access to without power. If you're on a well, you don't have running water. This is where that bathtub of water comes in handy. If you don't have gas, you won't have any way to cook. If your power is out for more than 4 hours, you'll have to throw most things out your fridge and freezer, as they're no longer safe to eat. If it's still oppressively hot there, I highly recommend you try and get your hands on a battery-powered fan and enough batteries to run that thing for 24 hours a day for 7 days. Seriously, the #1 quality of life improvement post-hurricane. It may already be too late to get a generator, but if you think you want one, do not use it indoors. You will gas yourself and die. Seriously. Every hurricane, there's always someone who runs their generator indoors and kills their entire family. Also, make sure you looked up and know how to disengage your garage door motor, so that you can get that up after the storm, when you don't have power. It's usually pretty easy. Depending on where you are, and how robust your cell network is normally, you may or may not have cell reception. Normal text messages is the smallest thing you can send over the network, and it'll get through, even if multimedia messages or phone calls can't. Please note, group texts are MMS, not SMS. However, after Irma, the cell network was so damaged that I couldn't even get SMS through. I had to eventually drive into town a ways afterwards to get reception several days later. So that's probably going to crap out, so be prepared for possibly no communication either. Now we get to the point on whether or not you should actually stay. I feel comfortable riding out storms in Florida. I have a reasonably new concrete block house about 8 miles inland and not in a flood zone. But Florida has built itself to be a hurricane tank for the last 25 years. We have hip-style roofs to mitigate wind damage. We build concrete block. We have shatter-resistant glass for the windows. We build our houses up several feet above the road so that they don't flood. We have a ton of ditches and do a lot of work on drainage. Your home in your state likely hasn't done that same prep work we have. So think about how your house is constructed, how new it is. Are you above the level of the road you're on? Are you in a flood zone? How does the water drain when you get a lot of rain? In hurricanes, you hide from the wind, but you run from the water. That's why mandatory evacuations are for areas in danger of storm surge and flooding. It's already a Cat 4 and predicted to just be under a Cat 5 by the time it hits. And there's not anything in the way that'll bleed any of that off, really. I'm seriously expecting the Carolinas to get wrecked in a way that we wouldn't be if it hit here in Florida. Good luck, and make sure you prep for that aftermath. Floridian here. I've ridden out my share of major storms. The first one was Hurricane Ivan. That was the worst. The one that probably scared me the most and did the most damage to the immediate area. That night, me and my family went into the master bathroom, and it was pitch black minus the flashlight. The winds absolutely roared. The roof was pummeled with rain and debris. At a certain point, the radio lost a signal, which added an extra layer of creepiness. The neighborhood was in pretty decent shape, but thousands of trees had been uprooted or simply snapped. Knocked out all of the power for over a week. The next was Hurricane Dennis a year later. That one was also pretty bad, but hit during the day, so it was much less scary. My sister and I went out into the yard until the winds picked up to dangerous levels. Hurricane Katrina didn't hit us hard at all, but it did manage to knock the power out. Another daytime storm, so it was kind of neat to be able to watch it in action. It knocked out the power for about 10 hours, not knowing when the power would be restored. We went ahead and started cooking all of the frozen meat, that way we didn't want it to spoil. We had pork chops, bacon, sausage, the works. Right as we finished cooking it all, the lights came back on. Then was Hurricane Irma. Didn't hit me too bad, but I was in an older house surrounded by trees which can be dangerous at lower wind speeds. Another daytime storm. It wasn't too eventful. I slept through most of it and at one point got up and saw the trees swaying to and fro, probably moving at least 10 feet at the top. For those in the path of Florence, be careful. These storms can kill you. They can cause incredible damage. If you're on the coast, you need to evacuate. I wish you all the best.
I arrived in Biloxi, Mississippi almost 50 years ago, a young military wife. It was during the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Camille that my husband returned from Vietnam to Keesler AFB to finish his 4-year stint. What I saw, or rather we saw, was something so catastrophic, we swore off of ever living in a hurricane-prone coastal city forever. Visit? Maybe. Keep in mind that Camille was not a storm of size, as some hurricanes are, and the pristine beaches of Mississippi with their pale sand and glittering calm Gulf waters were not yet discovered, so the residential areas were still relatively uncrowded. There were only 1, 2, or 3-story older structures, on pilings or on concrete slabs. Thus, the somewhat compact Camille would not take out the entire coast, but what she did hit was totally and completely annihilated. Since we were just arriving in town for the first time, Biloxi and the adjacent miles upon miles of white sand beaches simply looked like extremely underdeveloped areas to us. Damage? We didn't notice much. It was just beaches. Upon closer observation, we suddenly noticed pilings after pilings and empty concrete pads, but there was no wreckage on the beaches. Then we found out why. Dozens of tornadoes in our immediate area had touched down, just ahead of Camille. They were evidently her calling card. People who left late spoke of rows of funnel clouds tearing across the shoreline, doing initial damage to structures. But as Camille drew closer, her own winds took over. At 100 miles per hour, authorities thought the worst was upon the coast. But as they also told us, it would continue to increase to become a howling living hell. The destruction would be horrific. I need to add that in the hours prior to Camille, while a very inexperienced public debated on staying or going, reports came into the authorities of roads being alive with snakes, swamp critters, and wildlife. They were fleeing the area. Their exodus even made some roads slick as tires crushed the crowded pavement. And it began when terrain-leveling winds were destroying homes around their occupants, and those who still were alive thought they still had a chance. In rushed Camille's crushing 30-plus-foot ocean surges, moving far inland. The tsunami-like surges destroyed levees, roads, homes, commercial dwellings, killing abandoned livestock, wildlife, and whatever poor people who tried to ride it out. Not a huge number of deaths, perhaps 250, but only because of a last-minute race to get off the peninsula before the Bay Bridge closed. Still, it was death to those coastal dwellers that stayed. Thus, hurricane parties ended in death. Riding it out did too, and the lack of evident wreckage along the once prime real estate was because nothing was left. It was so mind-boggling to us with our Midwestern roots. When locals showed us the before pictures, we finally realized that the Mississippi coast was gone. Water had both ravaged and then washed away the destruction in areas closest to the ocean. But further inland, where the water just kept rising, it would be a different story. Wreckage stood as tall as the former buildings. It looked like an enormous army of warriors with chainsaws. Flamethrowers and bombs had come through, and scattered among the wreckage, most of the Biloxi shrimp boat fleet lay in ruin, and gigantic barges tipped sideways that were driven over 2 miles inland. The city was still reeling. One thing that still bothers me in dreams was when I was sitting at a light about 2 miles inland. We'd been living there for a few months, and I was comfortable in a city that was struggling to rebuild. It was dinner time and I was bringing home some carryout. Suddenly I saw the taillights of the vehicles in front of me drop. I watched in horror as 2 cars and a pickup disappeared into a deep sinkhole that had opened up without warning. It was evening, so the traffic behind me didn't see it, and began honking as I sat terrified with both of my feet locked on the brake pedal, sure that I would be next. Once the other drivers realized what happened, they did back up, and I got away from that huge hole. Camille had evidently cracked through the sealers used to keep rocks in place, so erosion didn't occur. Thousands of waves a day, months later, ate caverns under the coastal highway I-90 and into the town. I recall that I had purchased seafood gumbo for dinner, but once I got home, I was so shaken my husband opened a bottle of bourbon he'd been saving for when his enlistment ended. After a healthy dose, my insides finally calmed enough to eat. The base was short on available housing, as off-base housing was destroyed, forcing the military families to take whatever was available. So that last year, we lived in a large house that was converted into several rental apartments, only to find out later that it had been completely submerged in Camille. The walls became soft as rot, and mold grew behind the lousy paint job. Drinking water became tainted, and I got a rare strep infection that not only nearly killed me, but caused me to miscarry. It would take nearly a year to cure once we got back to the burbs of Chicago. Thank God for good Midwestern doctors. Camille is still the second most powerful storm to make landfall in the USA. Because the instruments of that era were primitive, today's meteorologists put her sustained winds at 180 miles per hour plus. However, for those of us who were there to listen to the reports days and weeks following the storm, 2 separate wind meters, including one at Keesler AFB, measured sustained winds of 200 mph before snapping off of their supports, and barometric pressure dropped to a horrific low of 900 mb. Only the 1935 Texas Labor Day hurricane was stronger. No, I wasn't in Camille, but I will never forget her wrath. I learned that a few months after we came home, our residence was leveled by the Board of Health, along with whatever homes in the area that, despite being erect, were rotting from within. It would be years before most of the damage was eradicated, but Biloxi has been hurricane hit more than a couple of times since then. Like I said in the beginning, a nice place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there.
I grew up in Florida. I don't even remember my first hurricane because I was still a toddler when it occurred. It was bad enough that the name Andrew was retired afterward. The first hurricane I remember is Aaron. That name was also retired, but not because of the severity of the storm. Rather, it was the flooding afterward that was the problem. It was so bad that we could swim in the street. I think the only way out of the neighborhood was by canoe. They completely revamped Florida's drainage system to prevent that from ever happening again. Mostly, though, I remember preparing for the storm. Tape on the windows, filling up the bathtubs with water so we'd be able to flush the toilets if the power went out, and hiding in the half bath once it had passed because it had spun off several tornadoes. The storm itself wasn't that bad. Later, we got a generator, which made dealing with the aftermath even easier. It didn't produce enough electricity to power the air conditioning, which kind of sucked. Florida in summertime with no air conditioning is no joke. But at least our food didn't spoil and our plumbing worked. We were on well water at the time. My senior year of high school was 2004 to 2005, the first year of drastically increased hurricane activity. The lower grades actually had an extra week or so tacked on at the end of the school year to make up for all of the school that we missed due to the storms. One of them, I think it was Francis, caused us to miss school for about 2 weeks if I remember correctly. The worst part for a lot of people was that they were without power for months, since there wasn't just the infrastructure to repair that much damage in a timely manner. But as a minor who wasn't responsible for dealing with insurance claims and repair companies, it wasn't that bad. In fact, a lot of Floridians joked about it. Probably partially a trauma response. But also, the same was Northerners' joke about heavy snow. It's bad and it sucks, but we know how to handle it. Heck, some of us even throw hurricane parties. And of course, there are always the memes. No one blows like Gaston. No one grows like Gaston. No one, I forgot the word that goes here, tropical lows like Gaston. He's particularly good at precipitating. My, what a storm, that Gaston. Hurricane Mitch flooded my 2-story house completely. I evacuated, and the waters didn't let me get back home for 3 days. When the water levels went down, I found my house covered with 1 foot of mud inside, plus 2 feet of mud for about 100 feet to get to it. Us neighbors had to shovel mud off the streets and sidewalks for a week to be able to get to our houses. Every door was jammed due to the sand on the locks. Most appliances survived the water, but the beds had to be replaced. Clothes were still usable, but the collars were faded. Photos and videos were lost. Same with books and notebooks. I was able to get back home after about 15 days of living at my mom's house. Things got back to normal about 6 months later. However, it took years for the whole country to get back to quote-unquote normal. And some places are still not the same to this day. My first job as a newcomer in Canada was at a busy real estate office. I was excited about the job. I saw it as an excellent opportunity for professional growth, and my coworkers were welcoming. My main task was to speak on the phone with prospective clients and drum up leads. All around me, phones were constantly ringing as other agents in the office took calls, bustled in and out for showings, and chatted with clients. Within the first few days of my new job, I felt overwhelmed. Even though I was used to a busy office atmosphere from my previous jobs, I was struggling to multitask and focus here. I couldn't seem to filter the sounds around me to hear clearly on the phone. The office seemed excessively loud, even though no one else seemed to be having any trouble. During that time, I also noticed I couldn't hear my daughter seated in the back of the car if the radio was on, even at a low volume. I was getting close to 40 and assumed hearing changes were a natural part of aging. I felt like the two issues were somehow connected. I had my hearing tested, and the results showed that there was nothing physically wrong, so I questioned the technician about why I was struggling to hear if the test showed no hearing loss. The technician hypothesized that my brain might be struggling to isolate and process multiple sounds simultaneously. That's when a light bulb went off. In 2019, my family and I barely survived Hurricane Dorian when it hit our home in the Bahamas. While we were sat waiting for the floodwaters to reach the attic and potentially drown us, the wind and rain that pounded the roof echoed remarkably in our cramped quarters. As we sat terrified during the worst experience of my life, the volume of the noise changed how my brain processed and interpreted sound. At least, that's what my wife and I felt must have happened. We were lucky to make it out alive and unharmed, save for many bruises. In the aftermath of Dorian, we immigrated to Canada with only 3 weeks of planning. The stress level in those first few months was immeasurable. Eventually, our whole family sought the help of a therapist. We understood that we could not cope with the emotional after effects of the natural disaster trauma on our own. Before Hurricane Dorian, I never had trouble isolating a person's voice in a crowded room. But it seems that the trauma of what we experienced was still affecting me 2 years later. Learning to cope with the anxiety brought on by surviving a natural disaster has taken many different strategies. I've practiced creative visualization, picturing calming locations, and listing all the sensory attributes associated with the image. Meditation and structured breathing exercises have been helpful when I've had trouble falling asleep, as my mind imagines I'm back in the ocean, being tossed around by the waves. I used a gratitude journal for a while to combat hopelessness and depression, when my mind fixated on the idea that I would never feel any better. Writing therapy helped me the most. After years of working on my mental health, I was finally making solid progress, and I started my new job at the real estate office, only to realize my new job might now be outside my capabilities. I sought the help of another therapist who specializes in trauma recovery. He explained that many people with PTSD struggle with symptoms similar to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, including an inability to sit still, check, struggling to multitask, check, and difficulty isolating sounds, check. I was floored. When I explained my problem to my boss, they were supportive and got me a phone headset. For several weeks, I continued trying to force my brain to process more sounds than it could, but eventually I was forced to resign from the position, and I took on a new job that allowed me to work from home and control the noise level in my workspace. More and more Canadians are experiencing the trauma of natural disasters yearly. Sadly, the frequency of these events is increasing. The historic flooding in Nova Scotia in July, and monumental wildfires continuing to burn throughout Canada, have kept natural disasters at the forefront of news outlets in 2023. The billions of dollars in property damages worldwide is evident for all to see, and it's horrific to hear about the number of lives lost. However, there is another invisible toll that these events have on people like me who survive them: mental illness. New Brunswick has experienced 2 milder post-tropical storms in 2023 so far. While I don't fear for my life during those events, as I did during Dorian, my anxiety increases with the constant updates and news preparations. It's an ongoing battle to remind my body that it doesn't need to react with a rush of adrenaline just because I have several things on my to-do list, including buying storm supplies. And I'm sure that I'm not the only one who feels this anxiety. Hurricane Ian upended everything for Cecilia Donald's family, their furniture, their home, and their lives. Water flooded Fort Myers, Florida home Wednesday night, leading her to believe that they may not make it out alive. We got on the counter at first, and then I told my husband, "I think we're going to drown," she said. They were so unsure of their survival that at one point, Donald and her husband considered tying themselves together so no one would wash away. But I couldn't find a rope, she said. Donald's daughter feared for the worst. They gave each other an emotional embrace when they saw one another for the first time on Thursday after Hurricane Ian had passed. The last message I got from her was that the water was waist high and she didn't know if they were going to make it, Donald's daughter said. Residents throughout Donald's neighborhood shared similar stories. Fire and rescue teams were going door to door conducting wellness checks because people were trapped inside their homes. One elderly couple was rescued and brought to safety. Spencer Mume posted a video to Facebook showing the water rising so high in his home that the only place his family could go was into the attic. He brought his 6-year-old daughter and 6-month-old daughter to safety there. CBS News met the grandparents of those kids on Thursday as they desperately looked for their grandchildren. "I can't imagine how they feel right now. Our little grandbaby probably scared to death, crying all night," the grandmother said. CBS News was able to share the good news with the grandparents that everyone was okay. Now, the entire community begins a journey to recovery that is likely to last much longer than the storm. Since Hurricane Ian made landfall in Florida on September 28th, survivors' harrowing stories of battling the Category 4 storm have slowly come to light. Ron Cook, a Florida Baptist disaster relief volunteer, shared an account his team heard about an 80-year-old neighbor who survived flash flooding and 155-mile-per-hour winds by taking shelter in his van, breathing through a small air pocket near the roof as storm waters surged through his vehicle and carried him away. On October 4th, Cook's team assisted homeowners Stan and Amy Wiggins, who had evacuated to Amy's sister's home when the storm started rolling in. Florida Baptist volunteers spent an entire day removing flood-damaged furniture, baseboards, and other fixtures after 4 feet of water flooded the entire first floor of their home. The day of the storm, I got a text from a neighbor who had escaped to their attic. They were in a 1-story house, Amy said. I got another text from a girl in our neighborhood who said they were on their counters watching their stuff floating by. We knew when we got home it would be bad. The Wigginses reached out to their McGregor Baptist Church family requesting help, and Florida volunteers with Cook's team stepped up to respond, as they'd done for many others in the community that week. It's overwhelming as far as the sense of gratitude, and just not knowing where to begin as far as expressing how thankful we are and how unexpected it is, said Stan of the help he and Amy received from Southern Baptists. It was daunting to see what was before us, and not even knowing where to begin, and then to have so many people come in and just lend hands and want to help out. Cook's team began recovery efforts, like their work with the Wiggins family the day after the storm. We're doing a mud out of their home. What that entails is removing all of their possessions affected by the floodwaters, Cook said. After that, we will remove all of the affected drywall and the insulation, taking everything down to the studs. Then we will be spraying for mold so we can get this home as livable as possible for them while they wait for the rebuilding. Cook said an incredible number of workers' orders requesting help have been coming in, and hundreds of Southern Baptist disaster relief teams from 17 state conventions are pouring into Southwest Florida to minister to the overwhelming need. So far, Southern Baptist volunteers have provided flood recovery, roofing repairs, debris removal, and more to over 500 homes impacted by Hurricane Ian. Another way SBDR volunteers are meeting needs is through emergency feeding. Southern Baptists have established 9 feeding sites, collectively preparing over 385,000 meals in cities like Port Charlotte, Fort Myers, and Naples to feed families who lost power during and after the storm. Thousands are still without power in the most impacted areas, and these volunteers will continue meeting this vital need until power is fully restored. Send Relief is supporting the SBDR response by sending emergency relief supplies and meals for survivors to disaster relief teams on the ground. Just days after the storm, Send Relief sent an initial shipment of recovery supplies, including protective suits, gloves, masks, and other construction materials. This truck was also loaded with bottled water, tarping for rooftops, and shockwave treatment to disinfect and kill dangerous bacteria in flooded homes. We're here to help support the state disaster relief teams, fill in any gaps that they may have in the response. We have multiple ways at the national level to help solve those problems, said Coy Webb, Crisis Response Director for Send Relief. We also seek to mobilize the resources they need quickly so that volunteers can get started as soon as they arrive. In anticipation of a long road to recovery in Florida, Send Relief sent a second semi-truck full of emergency relief supplies to restock inventory for SBDR teams and provide materials for the next phase of rebuilding. These emergency packages include roofing materials, Tyvek suits, N95 masks, safety glasses, and work gloves. Send Relief will continue sending shipments of supplies to help replenish SBDR inventory for volunteers on the ground, with the next shipment heading out to Florida on October 11th. We talk about the cooperative program, and usually we talk about it as a funding mechanism, said Florida Baptist Disaster Relief Director David Coggins. Cooperative program in this regard is not so much about the funding mechanism as it is really about the cooperative nature of what we do as Southern Baptists. This is it in practicality and reality. It's one thing to send your money to something. It's another thing to see the result of that in a very practical, experiential way. Thank you for your continued prayers for the Southern Baptist response in the wake of Hurricane Ian. Everything SBDR and Send Relief does to meet needs in the throes of a crisis center on not only meeting physical needs, but extending the invitation to receive eternal spiritual hope. We want to make sure that first and foremost that people know why we're here, who we're here to represent, and why we're doing what we do to bring them hope in the name of the Lord Jesus, said Coggins. That's always forefront in all our minds. Pray that our volunteers and our witnesses across all of our locations would be strong and powerful and visible. Pray for the homeowners and survivors. These folks have been devastated. Thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them. I also hope that you enjoy the extra rain at the end. Get a good night's sleep, everyone, and I'll read to you in the next video. Bye-bye now.